Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Weekly Walk. I'm your host Joshua Ingram. It is Monday, September 25th, year of our Lord 2023, and this is episode number 99. Sister on Facebook asked me a question about Romans chapter 11, where Paul talks about the fullness of the Gentiles. And the question was like, what does that mean? What is the fullness of the Gentiles? And when will it occur? When is unknowable. We don't know. Luke 21 also talks about a time of the Gentiles. And he talks about it as being a part of the end of the age. So we know this fullness of the Gentiles, or the time of the Gentiles, will conclude in the end of the age, in the last days. But what does the phrase mean, fullness of the Gentiles? Paul, in context, has been talking about this general idea of salvation, that salvation had belonged to the Jews. He calls them natural olive branches, that salvation was for them. They're the natural tree. That they are, if salvation is a tree, the Jews are, it's their heritage. It's their inheritance. The Jews are God's chosen people, the natural olive tree. And he talks about how some of their branches have been broken off, and wild olive branches are being grafted into the tree. So the wild olive branches would be Gentiles, that God is saving Gentiles and including them in the inheritance of Israel. He's including us we're adopted children of God. If the Jews are God's children, then the Gentiles that are saved are the adopted children. We're being added to the family. We're being added to the inheritance. And so that's the context there, that God is saving Gentiles and adding them into the inheritance of Israel, adding them into the inheritance of God, and making them members of God's family. But there's a fullness. There's a cutoff period. There's a time where that's going to stop. And that's what Luke is talking about in 21, where the time of the Gentiles will come to an end. There will be a fullness of the Gentiles that are brought in. There's a specific number that's going to be added into the family, and then it's going to cease. And then salvation will go back to the Jews. That all of Israel will be saved. So the natural olive branches will start to be grafted back into the tree, will be re-added to the inheritance. They've been cut off for a time. They're in a period of darkness because they rejected Jesus Christ. But that time is going to end. The ministry to the Gentile nations is going to end, and the ministry is going to go back to Israel. And that's what the book of Revelation is talking about. It's the time period when national Israel, the natural olive branches are being added back into the family of God, when salvation has gone back to the Jewish people. So I was thinking, like, what to get a broad overview of this. I was thinking about it, to understand that. I think I just explained it in a pretty easy to understand way there, but to get a bigger picture of it, in all of human history, from the time the world began, God has worked with an elect people. He has chosen some and not chosen others. Abel, not Cain. Jacob, not Esau. What was Isaac, not Ishmael? He's chosen a people group to work with. And as the population on earth grew and nations were formed, God specifically chose one nation to work with. He chose the the lineage of Jacob, who he called Israel, and his 12 children, the 12 tribes of Israel, national eth, what's the word I'm looking for? Ethnicity. That particular people group, the people group of Israel, the Israel nation, those are the ones God chose. So for all of human history, when you go back and you read through the scriptures, God, the God of all the universe, the creator God, the only God, the one true God, has only and specifically worked with Israel, with the nation of Israel. He's left all the other nations in darkness. He left the Canaanites, the Philistines, the Mesopotamians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, the Babylonians, the Egyptians, the Asian nations, the North and South American nations, the island groups. He left all those people in the dark and chose Israel as his people. Israel was his people group. And later on in the New Testament, we learn about election and how not all of Israel was true Israel, that God had a smaller remnant within the nation of Israel, but that were really his, that were his chosen saints, the born again, or I don't know if you'd refer to them as born again pre crucifixion, but however you want to define it. You had a nation of Israel, and it was only within that nation that God would select people to save. There were, like, during one of the prophets, thought he was the only one, and God said, no, I've reserved for myself 7,000 people that have not bowed the knee to Baal. So, but those 7,000 were within the nation of Israel. So it's Israel alone that God focused on. And that's been all of human history. Although there were prophecies made in the Old Testament that the Gentiles would see the light, that the Messiah would be a Messiah to both Jew and Gentile, but the Jews missed a lot of that. And that's why a lot of the religious ideology that the Jews formed was very racist and what's the word, ethnocentric? Is that what it is? Very focused on Judaism. Like they hated, like, even the Samaritans, who were half Jews, and I forget what the other half is, half Canaanite, half something, I don't know. But they hated them. They were very prejudiced against them. When Jonah was asked to go preach to Nineveh, he hated the idea because he hated Ninevites. And he knew God is merciful. If God's asking me to go preach to these people, obviously God's going to save them. And I don't want them saved. I don't like these people. That was Jonah's idea. And that's why he fled. But for all, and so when I say that God worked within Israel, that doesn't mean that people outside of Israel didn't get saved. God, on occasion, will save people outside of Israel, but for the most part, the vast majority, like I think, who was it? Ruth? Was that her name? Naomi was a Jew, I think, and she chose 2 non-Jews to be her son's wives, and Ruth, I don't know, I might be getting my biblical characters messed up, so forgive me if I'm wrong here, but Ruth was not a Jew, but she ends up being included in the promises of God. She gets grafted in, so to speak, from a foreign nation, and she ends up being part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. She ends up being part of that bloodline, because I think from her comes Jesse and David. I think. I don't know. I'd have to go back. Forgive me on that. But the point is that God was mainly focused on Israel on occasion. So Israel had the light of God, had the revelation of God. And within that, he's choosing some to be his and some passing over. But the rest of the world lays in spiritual darkness. Creating false gods and worshiping demons, and that's where you get Moloch and Baal and Ashtaroth and all the nonsense of all the pagan deities. It all comes from God passing them over and leaving them in darkness. But people seeing creation and knowing something made it and desiring to worship, creating their own gods, being given over to the vain futility of their minds and creating fake gods. But so Israel had the light of God, while the rest of the Gentile world laid. Oh man, I'm having a bad brain day. My brain's not functioning at full capacity here. But the Gentile world lied in darkness, and Israel had the light. Now, during this, Israel goes through lots of periods of chastisement, and because Israel a lot of times rejects God and worships false gods, they get influenced by these Gentile nations that surround them, and they committed idolatry and turn against God, and because of that, they're conquered a lot and have a lot of wars and trials and tribulations and hardships. And at one point in time, they're taken into the captivity of Babylon. And Daniel is reading the book of Jeremiah, and he sees a prophecy that Jeremiah made that Israel would be captive in Babylon for 70 years. And he realizes, man, we're approaching that time frame. And so he starts praying, Lord, how long? And instead of getting a direct answer to that question, God sends the angel, I think it was Michael or Gabriel or something like that, but sends the angel to tell him not just about the Babylonian captivity, but all of Jewish history. He says the Jews have 490 years left. God, am going to personally work with Israel for another 490 years. And at the end of that period, I'm going to end it all. I'm going to end the vision. I'm going to bring in everlasting righteousness. I'm going to put an end to the sacrificial system. I'm going to end all things. There's 490 years left. And he tells Daniel, you can start this clock from the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem. When the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem comes, he says that's when the clock starts. There's 490 years left from that point for the Jewish people. And then God gives him additional information and says at the 483-year mark, Messiah is going to be revealed. I'm going to bring the Messiah at that 483-year period. So when there's only 7 years left for the Jewish people, Messiah will come. So Messiah starts that last 7-year period. But in the middle of that 7 years, in the middle of his ministry, he's going to be cut off. But he's not going to be cut off for himself. He's going to be cut off for the people. And so the prophecy is given about Jesus' crucifixion. Daniel's told from the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem, which came in 457 BC, until the revealing of the Messiah, will be 483 years. Well, Luke chapter 2 records that Jesus was anointed, baptized in 27 AD, exactly 483 years after the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem. That prophecy was fulfilled to the letter. And Jesus started his ministry. And Jesus often was quoted as saying, my ministry is for the Jews. I'm here for the Jewish people. I'm here to be a light to the Jews. It's not good for me to take the food due to the children of God and give it to dogs, he says at one point in time, referring to the Gentile nations. My ministry is for the Jewish people, because it was still part of that 400. Remember, the Jews had 490 years left from the commandment to rebuild Jerusalem. And so at the 486.5-year mark, Jesus is cut off. How long was Jesus' ministry? He started in 27 AD, and he ministered for 3.5 years, exactly in the middle of that last 7-year period. But then he was cut off. He was crucified. But he wasn't crucified for himself. He was crucified for the Jewish people. He didn't do anything to deserve it, but he took, not just the Jews, but all of us that are elect, he took our punishment. So the Jewish people's time frame was paused at that point in time. because the ministry then went to the Gentiles. It had been for the Jews up until that point. But when they rejected Christ and crucified him, the ministry was paused. There's still 3.5 years left. There's a 3.5 year period still left for the Jewish people, but it was paused because the ministry went to the Gentiles. Paul specifically said, I'm going, he basically brushed his hands, washed his hands of the Jewish people and said, all right, you guys reject this message, I'm going to the Gentiles. And so the ministry at that point in time, remember, all of human history, God had, even during Jesus's earthly period, the ministry was specifically for the Jewish nation. The ministry was specifically for the Hebrew people. The light of God was for Israel, and the Gentile world lied in darkness. But at the crucifixion, the light was then opened up to the Gentile worlds. The time of the Gentiles began. And the gospel went forth into all the nations. Paul traveled to Greece and Asia and Africa and Europe. Well, I don't know if Paul went into Europe, but I know the gospel went into Europe. So the gospel went forth, and from there into America and South America, years later. But the point is that the light of God was now being poured out on the Gentile nations, while Israel went into darkness. Israel rejected the gospel of Jesus Christ, and so they've rejected God. They've gone into darkness. The roles have been reversed. All of human history, the light of God was for Israel, while the Gentiles lied in darkness. Well, now, since the crucifixion, the light of God has been on the Gentile nations, while Israel has lied in darkness. Israel rejected the Messiah, and so they've been temporarily cast aside. They've been temporarily blinded. They've been opposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, and they've suffered. Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, and ever since then, the Jews were spread out all over the world. They were dispersed. They no longer had a nation until 1945 or whatever it was. May 1st, 1945, when all of a sudden Israel was reformed, and the Jews had a nation again, which is a sign of the times that we're in the last days. But that's neither here nor there. The point is that we are now living in the time of the Gentiles. And we have been for 2,000 years, 2,020 years, ever since the crucifixion. We've been in the time of the Gentiles. Wild olive branches, us Gentiles, are being saved and grafted in, added to the family of God. We're being added to the inheritance of God. We become adopted Jews, so to speak. We become adopted children of God. And that's been happening for, like I say, for 2,000 years. Gentile after Gentile after Gentile is getting saved, while very few Jews get saved. Just like in the past, with like Ruth as an example, very few Gentiles got saved. Now the roles are reversed. So when Paul talks about in Romans 11, the fulfillment of the time of the Gentiles, he's talking about there's an elect number. That only God knows. There's a specific time. There's a specific amount of Gentiles that are going to be saved, and when that ends, salvation's going to go back to the Jews, and because the scriptures talk about all of Israel being saved, that Paul talks about that all the Jews will get saved. And Zechariah, I think in like chapter 12 or chapter 14 or something like that, talks about how when Christ returns, the Jews will turn their eyes upon him and will mourn. They'll realize their mistake and be saved. So there, and that's what the book of Revelation talks about. The book of Revelation several different times mentions a specific time frame. Remember, Jesus ministered for 3.5 years and then was cut off. So there's still 3.5 years left for the Jewish people. Because there was a pause put on it while the word went out to the Gentile nations. But when it goes back to the Jews, it restarts that clock. And there's a 3.5 year period left. And that's what the book of Revelation talks about. The book of Revelation mentions 1,260 days, which if you do the math is 3.5 years. It talks about 42 months, which again, if you do the math, is 3.5 years. It talks about time, times, and half a time. If we take time to be a year, time is 1 year, times is 2 years, and half a time is half. That's 3.5. 3.5 years. So that's the book of Revelation is talking about this period of time when salvation goes back to the Jews. And what's going to happen to the Gentile nations at that point in time? We're going to be thrown back into darkness. The gospel is going to be hindered. The gospel is going to be shut down in these Gentile nations. And my understanding of the book of Revelation is that we're going to be living in the beast system, the Antichrist system, a one world Antichrist government. That's going to shut down the gospel and is going to persecute Christians. It's that the book of Revelation talks about how the Jews will be protected. This one world beast system, this devil system, this Antichrist system will want to persecute Israel, but will be prevented from doing so. So instead, it'll turn its attention on to Christians and will persecute the Gentile Christians worldwide. We're not going to take the mark, so we won't be able to participate in the economy, and we're going to be hunted down and imprisoned and tortured and killed and martyred and beheaded for Christ's sake. And it says that we have to be patient. We have to patiently endure, trusting God, knowing that all they can do is kill the body, and then we're going into eternal glory. So, and if we're living in that time period, we know that the time is short. We don't know exactly how long it is, because time does continue on past the 3.5 year period for the Jews. At one point, that 3.5 year period in the book of Revelation is referred to as the second of 3 woes. And so if it's only the second woe, there's still a third woe after that, so there's still time after that. We don't know how long that time period's going to be, where the Gentile nations are hunted and persecuted by this beast system. But we know that Jesus said, I think in Matthew 24, that those days would be shortened for the elect's sake. For our sake, he's going to keep those days short. He's going to end it quickly. But that's what that's talking about, I think, is there's a time of the Gentiles that we're living in now, and have been for 2,000 years, that will be fulfilled. It's going to be completed. It's going to come to an end. And the gospel is going to be shut down, and we're going to go back into dark, pagan, evil, satanic days in these Gentile nations. And us Christians that have the light of God, we're going to be facing hard times during that, but praise God, he's going to be saving the Jews. There will be a revival in Israel, and the Jews will be getting saved. So, just thought I'd share my thoughts on that. I was just listening to MacArthur preach a sermon, and he mentioned a verse that made me think about some things that I really quickly wanted to record before the thought escapes me. But I'm just getting into the sermon, so I don't know exactly what his point is going to be, but I'm sure it's not this, because he's just mentioning this in passing. But he brought up that verse where Paul is rebuking one of the churches. I can't remember what letter it is, but he says, some of you say, I am of Apollos, or some of you say, I am of Paul, and some of you say, I am of Christ. And he says, was Paul crucified for you, or was Apollos crucified for you? Basically saying, he's rebuking the church because some people are, piously saying, well, I'm of this branch of, I come from Paul's teachings. Or somebody else is saying, well, I come from Apollos' teachings. And he's saying, there shouldn't be that kind of division. There shouldn't be that attitude in the church where you think you're something special because of the branch of faith that you come from. And I was thinking about, how does that apply today? And, of course, the mind immediately goes to all the different denominations. Somebody might say, well, I'm a Presbyterian, or, I'm a Baptist, or I'm Reformed, or I'm a Calvinist. And so in that kind of sense, we might have the same attitude as that early church did, where we're making some sort of pious distinction between us and other believers. And I've often heard people say, I don't like to refer to myself as such and such. Mostly I've heard it within Reformed circles when we're talking about the doctrines of grace. They'll say, well, I don't like to use the term Calvinist. I don't like to say I'm a Calvinist because, that term is offensive to many and blah, blah, blah. And I've often tried to defend, I don't mind calling myself that. And so I think there's a distinction between what Paul's rebuking the church for and why I would say that I am a Calvinist or Reformed or whatever. And so I just wanted to point out that distinction. I think it is a good thing to use those kinds of titles to kind of quantify your beliefs, so that if you're in a theological discussion or you're talking doctrine with somebody, they know what it is that you believe. They know where it is you're coming from. If I say if I were to try to define myself for the purpose of theological discussions, I would say I'm a Protestant. And what I mean by that is I am in protest, which is where the word Protestant comes from. Protestant. I am in protest of the Roman Catholic institution. Because historically, Rome has referred to itself as the church, the Christian church. And it's referred to itself as the only church, and that salvation is only found within it. And its teachings are heretical. Its teachings are anti-Bible. Its teachings are anti-Christ. And so I protest against that organization. And I call myself a Protestant because I am in opposition to the teachings of Rome. I stand opposed to them. I stand up in protest of them. So that phrase, that term Protestant, helps quantify where I stand in that particular issue. And then you have, I would say that I am Reformed in my soteriology. And what I mean by that, and I guess I have to be careful how I use that phrase, because I don't know what is all included in the Reformed theology. I don't know if you have to believe a certain kind of eschatology, or you have to believe in a certain ecclesiology to be considered Reformed. So I'm Reformed in my soteriology. I'm Reformed in my beliefs about salvation. I believe that salvation is, the five solas, by grace alone, through faith alone, by Jesus Christ alone, to the glory of God alone, and I believe in the scriptures alone as the authority over my faith. So those 5 points, if that's the soteriology of a Reformed belief, that's what I believe. So when I say I'm Reformed in my soteriology, that helps quantify that for discussion purposes. And I would say that I am a Calvinist. And again, I don't know all of what that includes. I don't know what Calvin taught on every subject. I've read very, very little of John Calvin, but what is historically referred to as Calvinism is tulip theology. I believe in the total depravity of man and the unconditional election of salvation and the limited atonement of Christ dying on the cross applying only to believers, and irresistible grace that when God calls you, He effectively changes your heart so that you're irresistibly drawn towards Him, and the perseverance of the saints that He seals you with His Holy Spirit and makes you His, and that's a permanent salvation. So in that sense, I am a Calvinist. So when I say that, it helps, and the other things that are implied by that, believing in the absolute sovereignty of God over all things, specifically over salvation. And I am post-tribulation in my eschatology. I believe because within the church, the rapture is such a big topic, it's important to qualify what I believe regarding the rapture. And I believe the scriptures teach that saints must endure to the end, that the rapture does not occur until the end of the tribulation, post-tribulation, when Christ returns. That's when we'll be given glorified bodies. That's when the saints will be resurrected from the dead. That's when the rapture will happen. And I'm historical premillennial in my eschatology. I believe in not a dispensational theology, but a historical premillennial theology, and so on and so forth. Things like that. KJV only. I believe that the scriptures are perfect and pure and preserved by God Himself, and that in the English language we have that in the King James Bible. And so using these terms, calling myself a Protestant, calling myself a Calvinist, calling myself a King James onlyist, that helps to decipher and again quantify where I stand on these important theological subjects, so that if I'm having a theological, and again, this is you wouldn't tell an unbeliever this, because all these terms mean nothing to them. But this is within the body, within the church body. We're supposed to discuss the meaty things. We're supposed to discuss the deep complexities of the Scripture. We're supposed to wrestle these things out together to come to a common understanding, to have one heart, one mind, to be of one body, so that we have that commonality. And so to help speed along that process, to help understand where it is I'm coming from, those terms can be very helpful. Those terms can explain to a person what it is I believe, and where my thought process is at, and how I view the scriptures, so that if we're going to then enter into a theological discussion, if we're going to enter into a Bible study, you're going to know where I'm coming from. You're going to know, he believes in the absolute sovereignty of God. So when he's discussing the scriptures, that belief is going to come out. You're going to understand things from that perspective. So in that sense, those terms are very helpful. Whereas what Paul is rebuking that church for, again, I can't remember where it's at, if it's in Galatians or whatever, but he's rebuking them for using that kind of as a superiority thing, as if, well, I'm a Calvinist, so thinking I'm better than you. I come from the teaching of Apollos. And that, in that sense, if we're using terms like that to imply superiority, then we're definitely in the wrong. I think a lot of times young believers struggle with this. We get overzealous and attack each other, because we're all zealous and hungry for truth. And so we view any untruth as an attack on the glory and the dignity of God, and an attack on the faith. And so we might erroneously jump to conclusions and consider people enemies of the faith, where reality is there might just be a misunderstanding, or we're using words incorrectly. A lot of times everything really does come down to semantics. We can be saying the same thing, just our understanding of terms and phrases is different, so we think we're saying something different, and we get all heated and fight over those things. And so if we're using our terminology to make ourselves superior to others, then we're falling into that error that Paul is warning about, where we're discriminating against other believers and viewing ourselves as better than them. We're viewing them as less than and inferior. And that should never be the case. Like, the reality is, there are born-again believers that are probably trapped in the Church of Rome. And there are born-again believers that belong to a different denomination of church or might not understand Reformed theology. There's born-again believers that mistakenly believe in Arminianism or semi-Arminianism or, some form of that. There's born-again believers that believe in a pre-trib rapture. There's born-again believers that think it's perfectly fine to read an ESV or a New King James Bible or something, and while I would hope that we can peacefully debate, or not even debate, because a debate is like two proud people. Debates are good to learn. Like, I find that a debate is an excellent way to learn, because if you watch a debate between two people with opposite views, they're both coming into it like a fight. They've trained, they've got their best ammunition, their best arguments. And so when you listen to a debate, you can get the best information from both sides, and you can glean a lot. You can really learn a lot from that. So I like debates from that perspective. But the two people debating aren't going to be persuaded. They're the so-called experts. They're already fully persuaded in their mind to the point where they're willing to get up on a podium and defend their position. So odds are they're not really going to be persuaded by the other person's arguments. So a debate is usually for the audience, not for the people doing the debate. So if we're coming together trying to figure out what truth is, a debate really isn't the way to go about it. An open discussion, and it takes a whole lot of humility to hear another person's position, and it takes great wisdom to carefully discern what's being said and to slowly dissect words and to find out exactly what it is a person means, what it is a person really believes. And then it takes humility to examine our beliefs, theirs and ours, in the light of scriptures and say, does this belief, does this position fully line up with the scriptures? And again, it takes humility to there's a lot of times where both parties seemingly have scriptures to back up their position. So it takes humility to look at it and go, are we interpreting this correctly? Are we looking at this accurately? Are we hearing it accurately? And so that's what group study is all about. That's what coming together and hearing each other out and carefully examining our positions by the light of the scriptures, realizing that the scriptures alone are our authority. It doesn't matter what John Calvin said, it matters what the Bible says. It doesn't matter what Joseph Arminius said, it matters what the Bible says. It doesn't matter what Whitefield said or John Wesley. It's what do the scriptures say? And does our beliefs line up with these scriptures? So that's the important thing. And again, using titles can help us to get off to a good start. But if we're using titles and coming into a discussion with some sort of superiority complex, as if, I'm a Protestant, therefore I'm better than you. You're wrong. And again, it's I can believe that I can even know that the teachings of an organization, the teachings of Rome, are wrong and heretical and antichrist. But that doesn't mean that a person who calls themselves a Roman Catholic is necessarily an enemy. And I think that's what Paul's getting at. It doesn't matter if you say you're of Paul or of Apollos, are you born again? Paul wasn't crucified for you. Apollos wasn't crucified for you. Rome wasn't crucified for us. The Methodist Church, which is based on the teachings of John Wesley wasn't crucified for us. The Lutheran Church was based on the teachings of Martin Luther. Martin Luther wasn't crucified for us. It's is this person born again? And if they're born again, then the titles don't matter. The truth matters. Let's get beyond the titles and get to the truth. And one other thought here quickly, and I don't know, I'm just going to say it because I don't know how to tie it all together with everything else. But MacArthur was also mentioning how some people go the super pious road and just say, oh, I'm of Christ. Because Paul rebukes that too. He says, some people are saying they're of Apollos, some say they're of Paul, some say they're of Christ. He lumps them all together, and at first glance you would think, well, why? If you say you're of Christ, well, that's the truth. But you hear people too nowadays say that, oh, I don't believe in titles, I'm just a Christian. And they say that. Think about the tone behind that. Think about the heart behind that. It says it's again a superiority thing. Like, oh, I don't, you can call yourself whatever you want, but I'm just a Christian. And people do that all the time, when we try to, because we're always trying to qualify, we're always trying to discern where a person's coming from. So a lot of times we'll ask, like, what church do you go to, or where do you stand on this, or are you a Calvinist, are you an Arminian? And somebody, oh, I don't believe in I'm just a Christian, I'm not any denomination, I'm just a born-again Christian. And again, I understand a lot of people probably aren't doing that out of a pious attitude, but it can come across that way. So there's some danger there too. It's all about the heart. It's, and that's what MacArthur's sermon is about. He's getting into humility. He's talking about specifically pastors. The fundamental characteristic of a pastor, of a minister, of a servant of God is humility. That needs to be first and foremost the most obvious and prevalent characteristic in that person. And so that's the point with the titles. If we're using titles as some sort of pride or some sort of, again, superiority, then we're doing it wrong. But if we're just using it to qualify what we believe, because, yeah, ultimately, I'm a born-again Christian. Are you a born-again Christian? That's all that matters. The Calvinism, the KJV only, that's just using that to explain where I'm coming from, and so I guess I've exhausted my thoughts here. I'm just going to keep rambling if I keep going, but I hope that makes sense. I hope it's clear what I'm trying to say here. I was sitting here thinking about my lack of prayer life again. I've talked about it, I think, a few different times on the podcast. If you follow me on social media, you know that I try to be transparent, so I'm sure I've posted quite a few things about it, but it was another time where, I realized, I haven't been in my prayer closet in so long. I have a home office. I work from home. So I have a home office, and right behind me in my office is my prayer closet. So it's there all day long. I see it all the time. I'm aware of it every day. And I don't go in there. And, so I'm sitting there thinking, like, why? What prevents me from going into prayer? Because there's such a lack of victory in my life. Such a lack of victory over persistent sins, a lack of victory over um, trying to motivate to stay busy for the Lord, to do ministry things, um, a lack of victory in a love and compassion for others. There's just, there's a lack of victory in so many areas, and um, it would seem that prayer is the answer. It would seem that consistent, dedicated, heartfelt prayer is the answer to these issues. And yet I don't go into prayer. And so it's like, why? Um, there's the daily prayers, the things that you say to God throughout the day in your heart, and the inner dialogue that you have. But where's that time where you really go into His presence, into the throne room, and sit and listen and make your petitions known? Is that a daily thing? And for me, it's certainly not. It's a rarity, and it's troublesome. And so I was sitting there thinking, like, why don't I do this? And I'm a lot of times, the heart is deceitful. So as a part of discernment, part of testing your own heart, part of knowing thyself, so to speak, is working through all the self-deception. Your heart will as it's like, if you're looking at your inner dialogue, if you were able to see it, you're trying to go deep into the heart, but your heart doesn't want to be exposed, and it's deceitful, so it'll lead you astray. There'll be roadblocks or different thoughts that pop up that just distract you and lead you in a different direction rather than down into the depths of the heart. And so part of being born again, really, for me, the most wonderful part that I've experienced is this soul searching, this heart searching that the Holy Spirit does within you, that He causes you to look within yourself and to not just look at surface level issues, but to dig deep and to try to find the root of why we do what we do, to find that root motive, that root desire, so that we can be aware of sin at its basest form, and we can see it in our hearts and be aware of it. And so when I think about, like, when I ask myself that question, why don't I pray? I'm trying to dig deep into the heart to see what's there, and immediately the heart wants to distract and go in different directions. But if I stay focused and calmly think this through, I feel like one of the main reasons is my theology, because knowing that God is all-knowing, and knowing that He is all-powerful, and knowing that He works all things according to the counsel of His will, and He knows the end from the beginning, and the book is already written, I feel like, for me, it's like, I convince myself, why would I go and petition God for X, Y, and Z when He's going to do what He's going to do, regardless of, what I say to Him, regardless of what I want or desire or what I bring to Him. He's already designed and planned, and nothing can thwart His will. He's already going to do what He's going to do. And so I have a hard time with it, because I was thinking about it like as a kid. If a kid, like, has just resolved himself to his father's will, a child who is just determined in his heart, okay, Dad knows what he's doing. I've determined my dad is wise, and he is good, and he's firm, and he's just, and he knows exactly what's going on, and he has everything worked out. He has, everything is working according to his plan, so I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to ask him for anything. I don't have to petition. I don't have to complain. I just have to go with the flow. What's going to happen is going to happen. It's part of his plan. So that's kind of the way I look at it, like a kid who has just resolved himself to his father's will, like a child who said, Dad's going to do what Dad's going to do. He knows what's best. He knows what I want, and he knows whether or not what I want is good for me. And he knows what is good for me, and he knows when to give it and how to give it, and he knows what path to take. So I don't really need to go to him and ask him for anything. I just need to sit here and watch his plan unfold. I just need to be content. That's kind of the heart that I have, which causes me to not pray, because it's like it's all worked out anyways. And then in the back of my mind, there's this idea that while all of that is true, God also desires our communication with him. He also wants us to pray. He wants us to petition. I mean, Jesus, as our example, he prayed all the time. He, more than anybody, knew about the sovereignty of God, and yet he still prayed. So, it's an oxymoron in my mind. It's a perplexity of, I know God's gonna do what God's gonna do, so why should I pray? And then knowing that, excuse me. But also knowing that he desires me to pray, and that he works through prayer, causes a malfunction in the, what do they call it? The synapses. What do they call the brain firing mechanisms? What is it? I can't remember, but it causes a malfunction in my brain where I can't connect the dots. Because I lean so heavily on the side of sovereignty, prayer is not a priority for me. It's like, again, God's going to do what God's going to do. But I sense that I'm unbalanced in that, because while that is true, again, God still desires me to pray. So, I don't know, I'm trying to work that out. It's just a complexity in my heart that's just, if I use that analogy of the kid with his dad, the dad still wants the kid to come to him, right? To talk to him. I think maybe it's just the wrong idea of prayer. Maybe prayer isn't about coming to God and saying, hey, Dad, I sure would desire X, Y, and Z. Maybe it's just about coming to Dad and saying, what's next, Dad? What do you want me to do? And strengthen me for whatever, or give me what I need for whatever plan you have, whatever the next step is. Provide for me. But he is going to provide, so it's like, I don't know, it's this weird balancing act. I know whatever tomorrow holds is designed by God, and he's going to give me whatever I need to deal with it. So then again, it's like, then why do I need to pray about it? It's going to work itself out. It's almost like, is prayer arbitrary? I don't know. Again, it's just a complexity in my brain that I don't urgently seek prayer because I know that tomorrow is already planned. So but then again, there's a mystery there because I know I'm missing out on something. You know, I know there's that prayer is a beautiful, amazing thing. So why am I cheating myself of it? I don't know if any of this makes sense. I'm just kind of, I didn't really think before I started recording, so I'm just kind of blabbering on and on. But it's discouraging. I know we are commanded to pray, and again, I see the example Jesus gave us about how much he prayed. And he had a lot more belief in the sovereignty of God than I do. And yet he still went and prayed, and he still petitioned, he still asked for things, even knowing that, you know, whether or not he asked for them, whatever was designed was going to happen. There's just, sometimes I hate my logical brain, you know. I just, when I can't connect dots, I get so frustrated and kind of just set it aside and move on and consider it irrelevant. Like, I don't do well with mysteries, you know? Like, I have to see the connection. I have to see, like, when you, like, this is a completely different subject, but the scriptures talk about, remember when Paul said, I think it was Paul or maybe it was Peter, talked about the base things of the faith, like the laying on of hands and baptism and the resurrection. And he called those things like the fundamentals, the firsts, like those are the basic teachings of Christianity. And yet those are the things that are the most mysterious and I struggle with the most, like laying on of hands. Like, what is the logic in that? I can't see the A to Z process on it. I don't have the steps laid out for me. Like, I don't have clear instructions like, okay, this is what you do, this is what happens, this is the result. There you go. It's just an instruction that says do it. Or like, you know, when you're sick, go to the elders and have them anoint you with oil. It's like just this, it's like this instruction without the why, without, it doesn't tell you why to do this. It doesn't tell you, it just says do it. And I struggle with those types of things. And I feel like prayer is kind of like that, this mysterious thing that, you know, we're told to do. And it's like, okay, I get that, but Lord, my prayers aren't going to change anything. You know, you're going to do what you're going to do. Tomorrow is already, there is no time with you. You know, your counsel is worked out from beginning to end. The book is already written. Tomorrow is going to happen as it's meant to happen. So why do I need to? And it's not why do I need to, because I understand that prayer is a gift. It's something good for us. So it's not a need to, but it's like almost like, Lord, isn't there better things I could be doing with my time? Isn't it kind of futile? Isn't it kind of unnecessary? I don't know. It's a mystery. But anyways, I'm just blabbering here, so I'm going to wrap it up. Alright, so that's what I got for you guys this week. As always, I truly appreciate you listening. I love you, and Lord willing, we'll talk to you next time.